if we're going to have a sustainable local food system, we have to have local food. And we've done a pretty good job of convincing everybody that they need to eat locally. We haven't done as well a job as, you know, to get that food produced in a way that's sustainable and people can make a living and we can attract young farmers like maybe somebody here in this room. So that's what I work on mostly. And the three parts of the program before I go on into talking to you about other things are Community Farms program, where we're working with securing farms that are somehow shared or in and available to people, where people don't have to have the money to purchase their own farm, where there's more than one farming operation on that farm so that there can be some sense of community and connection to community on the farm. So that's a Community Farms program. The other is that we've been involved for a number of years on working at our own local seed capacity, starting off first of all with local organic seed growers, because we don't have enough seed, and you might know a little bit about the seed situation. I won't talk about that today, but that's something that's very dear to me and something that we are working quite closely on. And our main thrust now is to get seed communities organized all across BC. People who are interested to coming together and sharing their knowledge and learning how to grow out seed and trading their seed. That's the kind of momentum we're taking that program, that direction for that program. And the other is a really exciting new program we have called Urban Grain CSA. And I can talk a little bit more about that after. I had a long time to think about this on the bus coming up. And I thought, okay, how would I begin? Like everybody tells you, you have to have a good beginning, right? And I thought, well, my best stories actually come out of Simon Fraser. Because I think the very best story I have about what I'm calling the new generation farming, or farmer, and they are new pioneers, and I really mean that in the most traditional sense. They haven't a clue what they're doing, usually. They don't know whether it's going to work. They know it's really critically important. They're willing to bring their time, their intelligence, their resources, everything they can to make it work. And we are seeing a lot of young people who are really interested in farming. And a good example of this was 3 years ago. A friend of mine, Chris Bodner, who was working quite closely with me at Farm Folk City Folk, helping to fundraise for us, and his wife was the chair of Farm Folk City Folk, phoned me up and said, I have just read The Omnivore's Dilemma. I think I'm being called to farm. What do I do? And I said, oh, Chris, let me introduce you to a few people then. And I introduced him to the senior farmer on our farm, Dave McCandless, who took him under his wing and took him to Glen Valley. Glen Valley Farm Cooperative was just, their senior farmer was just deciding he was going to retire. And the co-op was in a bit of a dilemma. They had put out a call for new farmers, and they wanted proposals, and here was Chris, and they asked him if he wanted to put into a proposal to farm the land. I mean, he's just only just said he's interested in farming, but he had to make a decision, so he talked to Paige about it, and they said, well, we might as well put a proposal in. Well, Chris didn't have a clue about farming, but he knew how to communicate. He had his PhD in communication, in fact, and was teaching at Simon Fraser, so he put together a really good proposal. And in the process of interviewing them, they decided that it was as important for them to get somebody who was connected to community and interested in community as it was for someone who knew how to farm. And they chose Chris and another young man whose proposal was equally interesting to them and said, could you work together? So Chris and Jeremy, they formed a team, and they decided that they were, 3 years later now, Chris and Paige are on the farm. They have 2 children and a third one coming. And if there is a new young farmer that's going to lead the way into creating a situation where farmers can make a living, it'll be people like Chris Bodner. The other person is another Chris coming out of Simon Fraser as well. And he came to me at Farm Folk City Folk because he was in anthropology and doing a course. And he wanted to know what was the connection between Farm Folk City Folk and community, because we were really coming out of a very strong community base. So he shadowed me everywhere. We did everything together. And then, like the new ethics of anthropology, you can't just go into a community and take everything you want and leave, right? You have to kind of give something back. So he said, well, what could I do for you? And I said, here's a list of questions that I'm really curious about, and see if any of these interest you. And one of was, what grains did we used to grow in the Lower Mainland, and why did we stop growing them? So Chris picked up on that, and he just ran with it. He ran with it to a point where now he's sharing land with a friend. He has been growing wheat for the last 3 or 4 years. He mills it himself. He sells the flour at the farmer's market and makes his own bread. He's got a little business called the Flour Peddler. He grinds his grain with a bicycle that he refurbished, whatever. And he takes the odd contract from Simon Fraser just so he can make a bit of money, because this burgeoning business that he has is not really making him a living quite yet. And we have hired him on Farm Folk City Folk to coordinate our urban grains CSA. And it's interesting about urban grains because it came from another student when it went out at UBC Farm. She and her partner were students there, interns at UBC Farm. And they saw what was happening at Creston with grain CSA, if anybody knows about that. And they were, why don't we have that in Vancouver? So, I mean, grain in Vancouver, I was talking to my uncle who's a farmer and said, why would you want to grow grain in BC? You know, you get all this grain from the prairies, and couldn't understand at all how crazy we were. But anybody who's read the 100-Mile Diet knows that what we need if we want to really localize our food system is some grain. So they got a hold of a great grower in Agassiz, and he had his PhD in agricultural economics. His wife was actually the breadwinner, and he was trying to make the farm go, his family farm, and decided that he would love to grow the grain for the CSA. In 3 weeks, Isla and her partner, Martin, sold 200 CSAs in grain with a waiting list. That is how much interest there was actually here in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver to do that. So we were hugely successful in our first year. And in our second year, we decided to go with 300 customers. I think that we haven't quite reached the 300 mark, so I think there's still openings for that. But these are people who are willing to pay up front, just like you would pay to the ballet or to the Oilers or everything else, and then you get your tickets throughout, allowing the farmer to have a little bit of cash flow to start up with, and then having a kind of guaranteed, or sharing in the harvest is what it was originally intended, but in many ways the way it plays out now is it's more like a guaranteed box, or in the case of the CSA now we have the variety, you can have all flour, or you can have half flour and half whole kernels, or you can have a combination of it. So, yes?
What is CSA?
Oh, good question. A CSA is a community-supported agriculture. And what it intends to do is to have the consumer actually share in the risk that the farmer takes in putting a crop in and not knowing whether or not that crop is actually going to be abundant or whether they're going to experience problems along the way. Farm Folk City Folk 2 years ago advertised on our website 5 CSAs in BC. Today, if you go to our website, there are 32. So it is the movement. And what I see is that people like both the Chris's and Isla and these young people that are coming up are actually at the forefront of a real strong, growing movement towards local food. And one of the ways that farmers are marketing their product or see themselves marketing their product is through that model of CSA. We've got a honey CSA. We've got a fruit CSA now. One of our board members, it belongs to 6 CSAs. So she gets everything with this a relationship with up front. of supporting the farmer. And part of that movement is not only to put a face to the farmer, like so that you go into the supermarket and see that it's local and who the farmer is, but actually get to know who the farmer is. So why some of the farmers markets are so really thriving, and why they're an important not only place for people to come and buy and sell, but just a place for community, a place for people to gather and celebrate and to understand and recreate this kind of food culture that we're really missing. We're missing the food culture. We're also really missing the infrastructure. So part of the infrastructure is how do we take that product and market it, and what do we do with the surplus? What do we do with the waste? And there are people on all ends of all spectrums that are working on all those things. And all of those things working together is like our mission for Farm Folk City Folk is to working together to cultivate a local sustainable food system. And to me, that's very kind of, you know, broadly based. And I always like to think that we carry the good news. I'm coming with you with the good news. I am not ignorant or naive. I know what's happening out there with agribusiness. I know what's happening with GE seed. I know what's happening with our federal government and our policies to support exporting, and very, very little support for anything that's local. And I also know that we don't have to be tied to that. And we do have choices, and we can and do make choices every time we go and shop, every time we decide what we put in our mouth, every time we have some kind of consciousness of where that might have come from. We are helping and we are joining something that is different than that very destructive, I think, destructive to community and destructive to health. So we've just chosen to be part of what the alternative is. As small as it is and as hard as it is, it's more attractive. I've been a person who spent a good part of my time on a picket line at one point in my life, and I find that very discouraging. And I think the last really experience that I had with our agricultural land reserve was over and over again talking time and time again to the Agricultural Land Commission, begging them to please don't take this land out of the Agricultural Land Reserve. You know, all the reasons why we shouldn't do this. And it became very soul destroying. And at some point, I said to my friend Ramona Scott, who worked for the Land Conservancy, let's do something different. Let's see that this farmland gets farmed, because if it gets farmed, then you can't say anymore that it's not farmable. I mean, they're talking about land not being farmable because they purchased it as development and they stopped farming it, and of course it looks like it no longer can be farmed, but the soil has actually not gone away, it's right there. So I am very much more energized by seeing what we can do about that. Another really neat story about students that have been involved is there is some land in Abbotsford that a group of young people got together and got a contract or an agreement with the municipality of Abbotsford that they would let this land and lease this land to them to start up a farm, and they call it Skeeter Farm. And the three of them have done a really good job. This last year they had a great crop. They haven't given up their daytime jobs. They're just experimenting with it. They've gone to all their friends and formed a CSA, a small CSA, and they're selling to their friends just to get the hang of it. And they love doing it, so this year they're going to do it again. I went to see their farm at the end of the year, and it looked just so beautiful, and they were producing so much stuff, and I thought it was really great. I probably have 150 stories like this. So I kind of would like to pause a bit and see if there's any kind of questions that would help me direct a little bit more what I might want to talk about. So who has something that they came wanting to hear or find out about? Anybody? Don't be shy.
Oh,
Yeah.
I just came here at the last minute, but I'm actually from the coast here, but have moved to the Okanagan. And I understand what you say about the soul disturbingness of the ALC, and I see that happening in the Okanagan, where land gets purchased for development, and a lot of the governments in the Okanagan who initiate the request to take land out of the agricultural land reserve are in agreement with the developers. So, and I appreciate your optimism, so I'm just wondering if you could say, how do you get, what are other ways of getting people to start farming the land so that they can fight off the, it's quite a powerful movement.
And first of all, I want to say is that I support and sometimes get involved when I have time in parcels that are being, where there's applications to have it removed from the ALR. I think that's still incredibly important, and there are people who are working on that. And they are, in many cases, successful, I think. The work we have done has brought out the community and the protests from the community and all the research and evidence about why that land should be kept in the ALR is heard by the Commission. I mean, the commissioners do hear that, so that is important work still to continue to do. And then the other thing is just the wide range of options. Like through the Community Farms program, we are supporting groups of people who want to form cooperatives to purchase the land, so that's one way. The farm I'm on is a land cooperative, and the co-op purchased the land 32 years ago. But then Glen Valley was one that we were very instrumental in starting up, and that was a purchase probably just over 10 years ago. There's one on Keating Farm on Vancouver Island that just was a few years ago, and the most recent one we've been working with is 100 Mile House. And that's a story of a group of farmers who were going to lose the land because they were always squatting and had been for over 20 years. And when the land they were on was going to be sold, they formed a co-op, and we supported them to form that co-op, and they sold shares for $5,000 each shares, and were able to purchase the land. So I have very lots of optimism about that being a possibility in a community where there's a community group of people. And so that's one way. Another way is that there is land that people have that they would like to put in trust in some way, and they don't have to completely give it away. But for example, there's a group in Pender Island who formed a society called the Pender Island Farmland Acquisition Society. Very specific what they want to do. and they actually were able to get enough donations that they almost were able to get to purchase land. And they were able to give donations through the Land Conservancy, who was able to receipt them, so they were able to do that. And in the end, they didn't get that particular piece of land, but they're looking for another piece of land. So it is possible for a community group of people, to work around that. A society, a cooperative, a church, a municipality, some formal organized group who decides in their community that the essence of food security for a community is that there is land that is being farmed. And when people recognize that, then they have all kinds of creative ways to figure out how to do that. And then there's a wide range of people who are just leasing their land too as well. There's 2 young people out of the UBC internship program who went up to Pemberton, and they just leased an acre or so of land from Anna Helmer, who's an organic farmer, and that's how they're getting their start. So they're growing. This is their 2nd year growing on that land. They've connected with young farmers in the area, and they've decided they're going to form a cooperative, not to purchase land, but as a marketing co-op, so that they would all kind of connect, and together they would figure out how they could market their product collectively. And they're following a really good example for a young group that did that on Vancouver Island called Saanich Organics. And Robin Tunnicliff, again, she's gone back to university to take her her master's, and she's an active farmer. So I want to say about the new generation of farmers, they're very well educated, you know. So they bring maybe not a whole lot of farming skills, but you need a lot more skill to farm today than just knowing how to grow food. As important as that is, and as fundamental as that is, your approach to it is really important. Like Chris, who lives on our farm, who's one of our young farmers, who's now in her second year on our co-op farm, has her degree in biology. So how you know, what a resource that is to the farm. And you know, at night she just gets on her laptop and Googles something and figures something out and comes to us with what she thinks is the disease or the bug and what we might do about it. A very different level of intelligence is being brought to that. And when I share that with my 90-year-old mother, you know, whose farming experience was poverty and isolation and hard work, and it's very different today than it was then. We're not trying to go back to those days. I mean, we couldn't anyway. We're all connected online and whatever, but we're really in a very creative mode about how to figure it out today. Also considering, of course, our commitment to the environment. I think the thing that I'm most disturbed about in the Okanagan is how, and this is supported by our provincial government, who sees farming like wall-to-wall farming, so that the wildlife corridors get stripped from all of those farms, and then it's happening where I live, and where do the deer and all of the wildlife go? We either face extinction, or else they cluster in areas where there are problems. So that's a whole other discussion. Yeah.
There's a big, huge conversion of orchards to vineyards.
Yeah.
And once you get the vineyards, they put the big, huge fences up.
Yeah.
And it's changed the whole landscape.
Yeah, and I used to say sometimes it's like we're really supporting drinking and driving. we're turning the prairies into fuel, and we're turning our orchards into wine, right? And anyway, yeah. Not that.
It stays agriculture.
That's true.
I mean, that's the
yeah.
side of it.
Yeah. If you pave it, it's harder to get underneath it. Yeah.
Some of them are turned to is it trailer park? Like for some of those farms.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Ecotourism, they call it.
Yeah, and there's such a balance between all of that, right? There's such a, I mean, it's about good design. Rather than having all one or all something else, it's about good design. It's about looking at other models. It's about looking more at Europe and how some of that is integrated in a way, but still there's food production because we have to eat. If we don't depend on importing our food, then eating becomes really primary, and making sure we have clean water to drink and clean water to live, that becomes really primary, right? And the tourism just gets integrated into that, and it doesn't become the main source of our revenue and our activity, but it becomes an added value to it instead of the primary source. But then that comes back to how much our food costs, and people are always asking, why is food so expensive, and why is organic food so expensive? And I have a lot of patience with it. Some farmers don't, because it's not expensive. Because people can't afford it doesn't mean it's expensive. It means they can't afford it. It means there's something really wrong in a justice sense with how we, distribute our wealth, and how we recognize and how we pay people for the work they do, and how we take care of people who are compromised and everything. But it isn't because our food is expensive. Our food is really cheap. It's really cheap. It's cheaper than anywhere else in the world. So on the backs of the farmers, we know that our farmers get a much better result if they go directly through CSAs and farmers markets, and to people who really value it, who can taste the difference, and who can also value how it's grown as well.
I'm just wondering, I know that during the summer we have an abundance of produce coming in, like say from the Okanagan or locally. So how about during wintertime? What sort of produce are these farmers actually able to get to the markets? And I guess the second part of the question is, other than CSA and through farm markets, what other ways do these farmers actually have of getting their products out to the public?
Well, there are some distributors who distribute retail. So if you go to your retail outlets, you can see whether or not they have any local food. There's that way. There is the farm direct gate sales, which is there's a whole group of farmers who do that, who just directly sell from their farm itself. Our farm does three things. We go to the farmers markets, we have a CSA program, and we also sell directly to the restaurants. So the restaurants, for a lot of small farmers, can be good customers. They're very, what do you call it? They're high maintenance. Because but they're also who has really been at the forefront of creating a local cuisine and making it attractive for people to actually take pride in what we grow locally. But just to answer your question about the year-round nature of it, I think that if we look back 50 years ago on what we did, because we couldn't import food, we had a very different menu, so we ate differently. So we didn't expect to have salads all year round. Why would we have salads in the winter? Winter was for all the root crops, for the beautiful roasted vegetables, for the stews and the soups and all that. So yes, our farms could produce enough if we, number one, paid for our root crops and didn't expect them to be really cheap. If we had a way of storing them, so there's storage that's needed, that we don't have good enough storage. We now have some farmers markets that go year-round, so that provides opportunities for people to be able to purchase year-round. If we learned again how to preserve them, every culture does fermentation of some way. Kimchi, sauerkraut, you name it. We take those products when they're in season and we preserve them in some way so they become part of our winter diet. So I think it's about looking at what we eat and how we do it seasonally, learning to grow it on the shoulder end of it, so we can put it under kind of plastic, and if we put it under plastic and double plastic without any artificial light or heat, we can stretch those carrots in our right into the winter time in our climate. But you need to want to have carrots, So it's about making carrots really sexy and making turnips fantastic and having cultures and stories and songs about it. I know one time when I talked, somebody from Quebec came up and said, they have a whole culture around maple syrup. Like they have celebrations around it and stories and dances and fiddle tunes and you name it. So people take a real pride in it. Like we don't have that around turnips and beets, and beets are fantastic, but not many people know that.
I think beets are they're becoming more trendy
now. That's the whole thing. Yeah. But then there's the other edge of it where we are experiencing, like all of our food practically, except for a very base of seafood, and that's a whole other thing, and berries and root crops and all of that kind of thing, tubers and things like that. It was all at one point imported from seed that people brought from all over the world and adapted to our climate. So there are people that are working on citrus on Vancouver Island. There's a person who's got olive trees in Saturna Island that are selling olive trees, and all of this is happening at the same time. So people are introducing some things that we always thought we had to import and see whether we can grow them ourselves. And that's pretty interesting too as well. The other thing is how much food we waste. This is probably a group that knows all this, right? You know all this information. I'm probably just talking, but I'm reinforcing it, that we waste 50% of what we actually grow. So if we looked at actually, shrinking that So we've got it. We grow and we sell directly. People value what they buy and then they use it, all of it. And if they have a surplus of it, they somehow put it up in some way. They can it, they freeze it, they dry it, they ferment it. Then
is it called the food rescue or like these?
They've got the food runners that do the soups and stuff from the restaurant. There's gleaners. The biggest gleaning operation is out there in Abbotsford, but it gleans for the third world. But we're looking at maybe setting up some kind of a gleaning program also as well for local. But there's the fruit tree projects everywhere. Yeah, where if you've got a fruit tree in your backyard, you can phone up, somebody will come and pick it for you, and then the volunteers can get it, you can get some, the food bank can get some. So it's about valuing our food. Many, many ways to do that. Questions? Yes.
I have a question about how the cooperative farmers you're working with are thinking about the long term.
Good.
And this question stems, I would say, largely from my own experience. I may be part of this new generation of farmers in a way, having back home in Quebec, worked on a cooperative market garden and decided that I didn't want to pursue that way of farming because I was worried about the long term of having no investments of my own. If ever I got injured, if ever I had a family and wanted to be able to pass something on, or like have a space where my kids will be able to farm potentially, and feeling like then I would be left with nothing or only a share, where really as a farmer not expecting to ever make huge amounts of money out of it, so your investment in what you do is really in your land. So I'm wondering how some of the farmers you're working with have dealt with that, worked through it, or that type of thing.
You're right, and there's about half a dozen critical issues, and that's one of them. What's one of the big issues around it? And our farm hasn't done a great job because we come from that tradition and that background, and we're looking at, and it's interesting enough because I drove in with Michael and this was exactly the conversation we were having on the way in today. When we look at community farms, we're looking at recommending that even though the land might be held cooperatively and therefore will not be sold and so therefore will be farmed in perpetuity, that doesn't mean the businesses on the land can't make money. So it depends upon how you form your business. You can form a cooperative that makes money, or you can have an individual business that makes money. So that's one thing. One of the interesting things that happened when Chris and Jeremy were mentored by John when John at Glen Valley was retiring is that Chris insisted that John value his business. And basically John sold the business to Chris and Jeremy. So he got money for the business because and the way that Chris had figured out with the perennials is that John had put in this fantastic rhubarb, had taken care of it, and now it was going to produce like every year. So John needed to have some kind of residual for that. And how could they set that up so he could continue to get money from that rhubarb that he had planted? So we need to think of that in that way. We need to think of it in a way, and you're investing your life force energy more than probably your money, and how is that going to pay off for you in the future so that you have some kind of retirement plan or whatever. And Chris is on the lead on this. He knows exactly what he as a young farmer needs to do, and so when we had a round table of community farms, he kind of led the way about, we should have benefit package, we should have a retirement package, we should have this, and I'm taking him seriously because I think it's true. I think we need to look at all of those things that the rest of the population get, and we need to institute that for our farmers too as well. And there's no reason why, even if you're on a cooperative farm, you can't have some investment in your housing. It's just like having a condo or anything else. So community farms could definitely do that, rather than they could either invest in the housing and rent it out, or they could have some agreement where you can build your own house, and then when you go to sell it, you've got equity in your house. So I think we have to do that, or we're not going to attract people like yourself.
I look at our family, and no wonder my father and none of his brothers, went into farming because they saw their whole lives. They worked so hard. And my grandfather never got a vacation, never did anything for himself. He was always working. So it shows that there's this, we've got to flip it around somehow.
Well, I tell you that the new farming pioneers are not doing that.
Yeah.
David and Donna on our farm, they teach Tai Chi, and they wouldn't dream of going out and working on the farm during the time they're teaching Tai Chi, right?
Yeah.
That's just as equally a commitment to them as it is to farming. And other people play music, or they ride their bike, and everybody takes holidays in the middle of the summer, and we trade off the work that needs to be done because they have to go to a festival or something. It's like you're looking at life very differently than the way my mother farmed, for sure.
I think that's definitely more enticing to people like our age, is to look at it not as
and I think that that's what is attractive about a community farm, a community of people, is that particularly if you have animals, is like you can never get away. But if you share it with somebody else and you say, well, I'm going off, for a weekend, can you take the chickens out, or can you feed the horses, or whatever, then it's definitely a better lifestyle for people, more attractive. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just have a question, because this is one that I get asked all the time, is as a consumer, so if you decide that you can't leave and be a farmer, but you're pretty good, you're asking Safeway or Save On Foods for local food.
Yeah.
You go to the farmer's market on Sunday, and maybe you haven't been connected with CSA once or twice. What's the next step? Like, how can consumers help the sustainable food movement, and help the farmers, and kind of take it to the next level? Is there kind of another two things that they could do, or is that really all that's in their power?
Well, I think it certainly is up to the individual. Because I come from a nonprofit society that supports all this, I'd say, join, donate, become a volunteer, help us to put on events. Let's take a look at how we celebrate our local food. So there's that part of it. Farm Folk, City Folk, this year, because we have a new convivium for our slow food convivium, a new leader for our slow food convivium, we're partnering with slow food on lots of different things, and I'm really excited about that, because I've been to Terra Madre now in Italy, a gathering of farmers and producers for 3 times, and it's coming on its 4th time, and they've changed the whole nature of that event. And what slow food talks about is we are co-producers. It isn't like somehow you as a consumer are any less important. You are actually co-producing this local food system, and you do whatever it is depending upon your circumstances and your interest. It's not about guilting you into doing anything. It's about celebrating what you can do. And so, like, slow food is doing a lot, so that's another fun place, to connect with, and to connect with like-minded people. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
And learn how to can and do all of that kind of thing if you don't, because that's also really fun.
That's I guess the follow-up question too, is that there's been a lot of interest, especially on this campus too, about can we start growing our own food, say in our backyard?
Sure.
Balconies, and is that feasible, and how much can you do that? And
sure. When you may know the story about Cuba when the Soviet Union pulled out, and I understand, and the percentage kind of varies depending on who you talk to, but anywhere up to about 53% of their food is actually grown right in Havana. So they have turned every vacant property and every place that could grow food, they've turned it into food production. And we have all kinds of food production that can happen in Vancouver and in Burnaby and everywhere. We do actually have lots of arable land. It's about seeing that as being an interesting way and a fun way as well to spend your time, I think. And I think that it is interesting about the city of Vancouver, because they have this commitment of 2010 new plots in 2010, and they found that their waiting lists are now longer the more they have plots available, because people are more interested the more you promote it and publicize it. But again, with community gardens, it's also about community. You go out there and there's somebody else more experienced, and you get to learn how you do things, and you ask questions, and it's a way of socially connecting with people in a pretty healthy way. You know, an alternative to go to the pub. Well, I grew up in Yellowknife, and that's where everyone went. If you wanted to socially connect, you just went to the pub.
I think Chartwell's contract is ending. The university's planning on making a lot of changes to the
procurement policies.
Here. Is that something that's widely known, or I just found out about it because I don't normally pay attention to these things? Is that something people here know about?
I'm not sure if everyone would know about it. I know that the Chartwell's contract is coming up. What they're going to do with that contract is up in the air right now. Which
I understand they're going to turn it into a food court.
Yeah, they could possibly. I think there's some different discussions. They're trying to figure out what would be the most feasible method for the Burnaby campus. But what the important thing is that this is a really good time to voice your opinion on what you'd like to see. So this is something too that the Burnaby campus particularly has talked about over the years, especially with the SFE Local Food Project, is, you know, can we produce our own food on campus? Should we be pushing the food dining services to be selling local food? And a lot of this really comes down to, like, the co-producer concept is that the more people on campus who ask for local and who want these types of things like composting and local gardening and local foods offered in the dining services comes from people like you guys sending, you know, sustainability to SFU emails saying, oh, I really want that to happen, or going to dining services and asking for it. So yeah, I think we're going to see a wave of change, but we need support from the masses.
Mm-hmm.
But in a food court model, is that? I mean, like Yale, where Alice Waters' daughter went. It's easy to do. I think it's essentially organized, and they got it done because I think they got some, you know, good reception on, I guess, the board government.
Well, there's a really good example of how this happens in Toronto, if you know about that, with local Food Plus. And there is and they're national now, and we are working with Laurie Stalbrand, who is the executive director of that organization. They have actually, in the University of Toronto, helped to broker a contract where Toronto now is, I think, up to about 25% local food procurement. And what they have is a certification program, a third-party certification program, local food certification program, that then they've got institutions. They've been mostly successful at actually getting institutions to buy into that program. So yeah, and Laurie has been meeting with people in BC to see whether or not they can do something similar in BC. The institutions are the hardest to crack, I think. I think universities are probably will lead the way, because you've got a whole bunch of young people who are saying, hey, we want to eat better and we would like you to buy locally. The hospitals are probably the last of it. like my mother, when she was in Langley, found out her toast was toasted in Calgary. Toasted in Calgary and reheated in the microwave in Langley. She couldn't understand how come it all looked so good, but it tasted so bad. And then we found out that yes, that's the contract is with some large company in Calgary who manufactures it all and basically sends it in some kind of a container. So we've got a lot of work to do. So they like to. So personally, you've probably done as much as you can do. Then you need to get into the political arena, where the really hard work needs to be done in terms of, and you do that wherever you have a kind of personal interest and connection, like you know,
like on SFU campus.
Like on SFU campus, it makes sense because that's where you spend a lot of your time.
We don't have the best system culturally of how things are priced, but do you have any recommendations when people come back with the argument, well, I'm on such a tight budget that the idea of paying more for something
yeah
is
I'm pretty sensitive to that, and I'm just wondering, I think that I would probably have some kind of an educational presentation or workshop around it. And one of the things that I would really do is to take and compare. Let's say, okay, here we have a box of whole food. And here we have a typical fast food box that we might, because we're really short of time as well as money, you know, we might take a look at. And let's compare those two, both cost and also nutritionally, and see where the value is. Because I always maintain that if you actually, no matter how much your potatoes cost, even if they're organic, if you look at how much that potato costs and you look at a bag of potato chips, the bag of potato chips is going to be more costly than those whole potatoes. And of course, nutritionally, there probably isn't any comparison. So then let's look at how long it actually takes to cook a potato if you chop it up and put it in a pot to boil. So there's really, to my mind, there's a consciousness raising, there's an awareness raising, but if you did an actual workshop where you somehow could demonstrate all of that, I think you could turn a few heads around with it.
That's awesome. Yeah, some ways to make it feel easy and accessible would be really helpful.
And then there's also, because when people get boxes, they don't necessarily know what to do with it all, so then it's about, we just had we didn't have big turnout, but we just had opened up to our CSA customers to come to the farm on the first day of harvest, which was yesterday. And what David did was take all of the things in the boxes and make a meal with the stuff that was in the boxes. So that's another thing too. Andrea Carlson has done that for people, who is the chef at Bishop's. Take the things that would be in season, or take the things in the boxes, or have some kind of a potluck with just the local food, and what do we do with this? And David did the most amazing thing with garlic scapes. You know, when the garlic grows, it has this big curly thing called a garlic scape. People don't know what to do with it. I mean, it's great, it tastes good. You can do, and he did all kinds of stuff with it, and he cooked it with some coconut milk, and it was just amazing. So really, really simple things.
We find that CSA and the theme is sharing the risk.
Mm-hmm.
So do you mean that in the sense that the quantity that's produced is diminished because of weather or whatever, that the price would go up? Is that what you mean?
No, the CSA boxes typically are $500. Almost all CSAs are about $500 up front, and then 20 boxes. You get 20 boxes like for the season. So that, if you do the math on it, I think it's $25 a box worth of produce. In the original purist kind of CSA relationship, people put money up front and even worked on the farm, and then they shared the harvest. But almost nobody does it that way. What they do usually is guarantee that you will get a $25 value in terms of your box. Although in the beginning there might not be, and then later maybe it'll be adjusted in the season. You'll get a little bit more than 25. Some farms might give you a bonus because they've had a bonus. But if something doesn't turn out, then you don't get it. Or you get just a few, or you get a substitution, or you get a little bit more of something than what you might even want. So that more the risk, I think, is about the availability and the quantities and that kind of thing. A lot of CSAs I know, because I've kind of been talking to people across Canada with CSAs, a lot of them are even creatively working together on a CSA box. So one farm will grow 3 things and the other farm, or 6 or 7 or whatever, but they don't grow garlic and they don't grow carrots, so they get their carrots and garlic from somewhere else, and they do a partnership with it, and they figure out somehow how they can put the box together that way. So there's just a lot of variations. Every time I say something, I know that there's like these 6 variations on how that theme gets played out, depending on a person's circumstances. And then I know that in Toronto, Slow Food actually, they organized a CSA fair, and that might be something that, you know, the public could do. You have a CSA fair, the CSA farmers come in, they show their wares, You have people sign up there. So in our case, for example, our farm, we have about 5 delivery points, I think. And we don't deliver everywhere because we don't want to be going around and delivering directly to everybody's home, but we'll deliver to a depot. And other CSAs will deliver to other depots, and there may be something around this area that could deliver. So a fair is not necessarily competitive. I don't actually think anything in our slow food movement is competitive because we aren't growing enough yet to make it that way. We're not growing a surplus. We still have a long way to go to do that. So lots of things, yeah.
Just to follow up on the I think that you mentioned it, but you're saying that basically what they did is they changed the rules about what anyone could sell on campus food there.
They have, you know, that all campus food services have some kind of contract. And of course those contracts are for 5 or 6 or 7 years or whatever they are. So what Laurie would go into them is to go in and try and word the contract language in such a way that the contract person needs to source locally. And that the university needs to even be willing to pay a little more in order to do that. So, yeah.
I'm just wondering, because I think now, I talked to the guy, I found this out from the guy who's like in ancillary services who's organizing this. I sent an email with, you know, the thing about Yale, but
and
I don't think that he's going to do anything if people...
Just contact me and I'll connect you with all the resources on it. And I know that Ramona Scott, who used to work for the Land Conservancy, is now working for them, and she is getting farm certified and working at, you know, it's at the very ground level. And actually Laurie has talked to people at SFU too, so the more that you would be knowledgeable and aware of what's actually happening here already would be good.